What if the moment you needed God the most was the moment He chose not to speak? Imagine reaching the end of your strength, your patience, your understanding. Imagine doing everything right, praying, waiting, believing, and still hearing nothing. No answer, no sign, no reassurance, just silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that presses on your chest and forces a question you are afraid to ask. Did God forget me? If these stories help you see what others miss in the Bible, if you are someone who wants faith explained, not rushed, this channel exists for you. Stay with us. Subscribe, not out of habit, but because this journey is for those willing to slow down and listen deeply. The story we enter today does not open with danger or spectacle. It opens with waiting, days that stretch into nights, prayers repeated until the words feel thin, faith held quietly, without applause, without confirmation. The people in this story are not rebels or doubters. They are faithful, and that is what makes the silence so unsettling. Nothing is visibly wrong, yet nothing is changing. The sky looks the same, the ground feels the same, God feels distant. And in that space, fear begins to whisper questions louder than faith ever did. Questions about timing, about worth, about whether obedience still matters when nothing happens. But this is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because Scripture shows that silence is sometimes not a punishment, but a test. Not a rejection, but an invitation. A moment where God is not asking for action, but for trust without reassurance. The people do not know it yet, but the silence is already doing its work. It is stripping away shallow faith. It is revealing motives. It is separating those who follow God for answers from those who follow Him for who He is. This is not a story about instant miracles. It is about endurance. About standing still when everything inside demands movement. About learning that faith does not always grow through answers, but through unanswered moments. And here's the truth that makes this story impossible to ignore. You have lived this chapter before. In a season where nothing made sense. In a prayer that felt unanswered. In a moment where silence forced you to decide whether faith depended on outcomes or on trust. As this story unfolds, remember this: silence does not mean God has stopped working. It may mean He is working deeper than you can see. Stay with the story, because sometimes the quiet is where everything begins. A waiting that stretched too long. The place where this story unfolds is not dramatic. No palace, no battlefield, no burning sky, just a familiar land, ordinary people, and a routine they know by heart. Days begin the same way they always have. Work is done, meals are shared, prayers are spoken softly, almost automatically. On the surface, life continues. But underneath, something is wrong. Everyone feels it. A tension that has no shape, no sound, no clear enemy. They are waiting for God to move. Not because they are desperate strangers, but because they have history with Him. They remember past deliverance, old promises, stories told from generation to generation about how God acted at the right moment. And that memory is what makes the present silence so heavy. The waiting has lasted longer than expected, longer than comfort allows, longer than faith finds easy. At first, the silence was tolerated, interpreted as patience, as timing. But as days passed, questions began to rise quietly. Not spoken aloud, but felt deeply. Had they misunderstood the promise? Had they missed a step? Had obedience somehow failed? This is how tension enters the story, not through danger, but through delay. Because delay tests faith more deeply than opposition ever could. No one is chasing them. No one is threatening them. Yet fear grows. Not fear of loss, but fear of meaninglessness. Fear that their trust has been misplaced. Fear that silence might actually be absence. And still, nothing happens. The land remains unchanged. The sky gives no sign. Heaven offers no explanation. The quiet becomes the loudest presence in the room. This is the setting where faith is either reshaped or released. In Scripture, these moments matter. They are the crossroads where belief becomes something deeper than emotion, where trust is no longer supported by evidence but by decision. The people do not know it yet, but the silence has already drawn a line. Some are beginning to pull back emotionally. Others are clinging harder, though they cannot explain why. And a few are standing still, not confident, not certain, but unwilling to walk away. That is where the story pauses. Not because nothing is happening, but because everything is about to be tested. The conflict is not yet visible, but it is already forming. When faith is pressed by silence, the conflict does not arrive suddenly. It grows slowly, quietly, almost politely. At first it sounds like reasonable questions. How long is too long? At what point does waiting become foolish? When does faith turn into denial? No one shouts these questions. No one accuses God out loud. But they begin to shape decisions. Small compromises, subtle shifts in expectation. People still pray, but with less certainty. They still wait, but with one eye on the exit. This is how faith is tested in silence, not by force, but by erosion. The greatest struggle in this story is not against enemies or circumstances. It is against the human instinct to demand clarity, to insist on explanation, to believe that trust requires constant confirmation. The tension sharpens when options appear, logical ones, safe ones, reasonable paths that do not require waiting any longer. Paths that do not require trusting what cannot be seen. This is the moment Scripture often reveals but rarely dramatizes. The moment when obedience stops feeling spiritual and starts feeling risky. Some begin to move, quietly, carefully, without declaring rebellion. They tell themselves God will understand, that waiting indefinitely makes no sense. That action, even imperfect action, is better than stillness. Others hesitate. They feel the same pressure, the same uncertainty, the same fear, but something holds them. Not confidence, not clarity, just a quiet conviction that leaving now would cost more than waiting. This is where the conflict becomes clear, not between people and God, but between trust and control. Silence exposes motive. It reveals whether faith is rooted in relationship or in results. Because when God stops explaining himself, faith must decide whether it will remain without reassurance. The waiting now feels heavier. Every hour stretches. Every unanswered prayer feels louder. The temptation is no longer doubt. It is self-reliance disguised as wisdom. And still, heaven does not speak. But the story has reached its turning point. Because in Scripture, when silence is at its deepest, intervention is often closest. The question is no longer when God will act. It is who will still be standing when he does. The conflict is complete. Faith has been pressed. The next moment will reveal what remains. When silence breaks without sound, the change does not announce itself. There is no warning, no signal, no dramatic shift in the sky. At first, everything looks exactly the same. The silence remains, the waiting continues. And yet, something has changed. Not around them, but within the moment itself. What was once empty now feels deliberate. What felt like absence now carries weight. This is how God often moves when he has been silent. Not loudly, not suddenly, but precisely. Those who remain discover that the silence was not meant to be endured forever, but to prepare them. The waiting has sharpened their awareness. Their trust is quieter now, but stronger. It no longer depends on emotion or outcome. It stands on commitment. And then, without explanation, direction appears. Not as a voice from heaven, not as a public sign, but as clarity where confusion once ruled. A step becomes clear. A choice no longer feels forced. What once seemed impossible now feels inevitable. The path forward was not created in the moment. it was revealed. The miracle here is subtle, and that is what makes it powerful. God does not erase the silence. He fulfills its purpose. Those who left do not see it. They already moved on. But those who stayed recognize it instantly, not because it is spectacular, but because it aligns perfectly with what faith has been forming all along. This is where the story reveals its truth. God's silence was not delay. It was alignment, not distance, but design. Every moment of waiting was shaping perspective. Every unanswered prayer was refining trust. And now, when movement finally comes, it is not rushed. It is not chaotic. It is exact. The silence did not end with noise. It ended with direction. And that is how God often works, quietly transforming uncertainty into purpose. The miracle is not that God finally spoke. The miracle is that those who waited were ready when He did. What the silence was teaching all along. Only after the moment passes does the meaning become clear. Not during the waiting, not in the tension, but in reflection. This is where the story finally explains itself. Not through words from heaven, but through understanding formed by experience. The silence that once felt cruel now appears intentional. The delay that seemed empty now reveals its weight. The people realize something unsettling. If God had spoken earlier, they would not have been ready. They would have acted too quickly, trusted too shallowly, depended too much on clarity instead of conviction. The silence did not weaken faith. It purified it. What remains is not emotional confidence, but steady trust. A trust that does not panic when answers are delayed. A faith that no longer needs constant reassurance to remain faithful. This is the pattern Scripture repeats again and again. God often withholds explanation not to confuse but to mature. Not to test endurance but to deepen relationship. The revelation is not about timing, it is about transformation. Faith, they learn, is not proven when God responds immediately. It is proven when God does not. When obedience continues without applause, when trust remains without confirmation. This is the lesson hidden inside the silence. God was never absent. He was shaping something deeper than an outcome. He was forming people who could follow Him even when the path was unclear. And this truth reaches far beyond the story, because every person who has ever waited, prayed, hoped, and heard nothing has stood in this same place. The silence that felt personal was not rejection. It was preparation. The story leaves behind a quiet but powerful truth. God's greatest work often happens in the moments we are most tempted to walk away. And if faith survives there, it will survive anywhere. The faith that stayed. The story does not end with celebration. There is no sudden applause, no dramatic explanation from heaven. It ends with something quieter and far stronger. Those who remained did not stay because they were certain. They stayed because they chose to trust without guarantees. They learned that faith is not holding on until God speaks, but holding on even when He does not. The silence that once felt unbearable became a marker, a dividing line between faith that depends on answers and faith that rests in relationship. What God formed in the waiting could not have been created in noise. This is why the story matters. Because there will be moments in your life when God feels quiet, when prayers seem unanswered, when clarity does not come on time. And in those moments, this story gently asks a question, not aloud, but in the heart. Will you stay? Not because you understand, not because you feel strong, but because trust does not always need explanation. If this story resonated with you, if it named something you have felt but never said, these stories exist for people who want faith explained, not rushed. If you recognize yourself here, this journey is meant to continue. Subscribe, not out of habit, but because you want to keep seeing what others miss in the Bible. Before you go, Pause for a moment, and if you choose, place one simple word in the comments, not as performance, but as reflection, staying. Because sometimes the greatest act of faith is not receiving the answer. It is remaining when the silence comes, and in that quiet choice, faith becomes unshakable.